The Things We All Carry is a podcast about first responders and their stories surrounding trauma on the job. The intention of this podcast is to raise awareness and share meaningful conversation around a subject often viewed as taboo or simply ignored. Be aware this content may be graphic and it is real. It may not be suitable for children or adults triggered by this subject matter. What's your name and where are you from?
My name is Jamie Potter, and I work for Richmond Fire Department.
My name's Karen McKee. I'm from Mount Holly, New Jersey.
John Volt, firefighter, paramedic, from South Florida, captain, with about 15 years on the job.
And CBD extraordinaire.
My name is Kyle Brown. I'm from Medina, Tennessee.
If I asked you what mental wealth meant to you, how would you define it?
I would start out with the thought process of being able to view our lives as a survivor lifestyle instead of a victimized lifestyle. So everybody has challenges and things that they come up with that, pose problems to each of us along the way. But the moment that we can reframe our mind and not dwell on those moments really sets us into an ability to have a better outcome, if you will.
Making sure you take care of yourself by making sure you're not really overworking yourself, keeping your eyes, getting enough sleep kind of away for mental wealth, but just not overworking.
Mental wealth, kind of like that. I haven't heard that term. First thing that comes to my mind is, I would say, like a life of gratitude. You appreciate the things that you have so that you feel wealthy, even if you're not financially, you are emotionally and mentally wealthy. So you can have some resilience, I guess. Is the bad things that come along, you probably hold a little bit more resilient attitude towards if you feel like you're mentally wealthy. You've stacked up a bunch of capital in there that I guess you can fight off the bad stuff with.
I believe mental wealth would be described as being able to, how interested or how mental health is going to be intriguing to you as far as your gains mentally, as far as your mental goals on where you're wanting your mental health to be at and how close it is to you.
And how do you think you protect your mental wealth?
I would say that my first and foremost thing is working out every day, finding those coping mechanisms that work best for you. Mine is getting into a gym and getting after it a little bit, and spending time with my kids.
There's multiple different ways. For example, like therapy. A lot of people who are in our job go through therapy, which, that stigma is still high to this day. But therapy, working out, spending time with friends, family, just getting away from the job whenever you get a chance and just reflect on all the calls you've been on, or not letting just being able to let it out in a way.
I'm a big proponent of putting in regular work for this. And it's a big question, but I think what we have to do is practice very specific things. One of them, and people call it mindfulness or meditation, but I believe you actively have to pay attention to things that you are grateful for, because it's so easy to get lost in all the bad stuff that we forget. There are good things to pay attention to. They get lost. There is a component of physical wellness, physical toughness to mental resilience and mental wellness too. You have to stay on that too, because pushing yourself physically or making yourself uncomfortable physically, there is science behind making yourself mentally resilient too. And then taking time for yourself, man. There has to be a component where you are practicing that, whether it's hobbies or self-care, whatever you want to call it, but it's, time off. It's got to be focused on yourself where you can actually unplug.
Surround yourself with quality people. And in the end, it takes a village, but at the same time, for yourself, kind of get involved, being healthy, going to the gym, making small incremental goals for yourself.
Hey guys, welcome back to The Things We All Carry. I've already recorded one intro and I walked away from it and I wasn't happy with it. And I think that's the issue with sometimes doing these intros
with really no thought in mind of what I'm going to say. And it's been one of those weeks where I kind of escaped a little bit. And by escape, I mean I ignored the world as much as possible. And I went down one of those gopher holes that we talked about on the show in the past. And I think it was Eric down in Florida who talked about it being a gopher. You know, we're all gophers. You know, we can disappear real quick. We'll go underground. We kind of get through what we need to get through and pop up. And then we sit here and we go, well, why didn't we talk about it? Well, we didn't talk about it because we were underground at that time and nobody saw what we were feeling. And Kenny Mitchell talked about in his episode last week. You know, he said he met a friend on the side of the road and they both were hurting, but they didn't decide to say anything to each other. If one of them had just said, hey man, I'm struggling, the other one might've said, hey, I'm struggling too. Let's talk this out. And it's funny, we don't do that well, even in this circle of mine where I know that I need to talk to people. I know that I need to reach out. I know that I need to say to somebody, hey, listen, I just need to talk for a minute. Let's grab coffee. Or even when I get the offer of coffee, I don't take it up because I just wasn't ready to talk. And I'm not sure, I'm not even sure what I'm going to talk about. I just know that at some point I'm going to need to talk. And so it's probably time for me to take a step and reach out to my therapist and say, hey, let's meet. Let me just bounce some shit off of you and get it out of my head. And I know what she's going to say. I can hear her voice now and I laugh about it, but it's almost like I can't do it unless I hear her say, do it. So, I want to give a shout out to a few people that were there that checked in on me and said, hey, what's the deal? Where are you? Why are you MIA? They know who they are and it's much appreciated. You guys are invaluable. And so I can't do this thing called life without the support and those people in my life. And some of what I've talked about right there comes to light in this week's episode because I talk about the brain and we have a whole almost 2 hours talking about the brain and the damage done to a brain. And, you know, at the end, we get into a conversation about retirees, you know, people who have stepped away from the fire service, law enforcement, the military, and how they deal with it. Because I'm telling you, this is a speeding train. And once you decide to jump off, you stop, you come to a standstill, but the rest of that keeps going. It goes forward. Whatever speed it was going when you were on it, it keeps going. But you stop and you come to an abrupt halt and it's a painful stop at times. And so I thought things don't magically get better for you when you step away from the fire service. You know, you don't just forget about some of the shit you saw. You don't just dump your traumas out. But there's kind of a belief that, yeah, things do work that way. Well, I can tell you they don't. And we get into a talk about why it is that retirees or people that have been out of the game for a while, it pops up at weird times. And it has to do with keeping yourself busy, working through the traumas, talking, and going through some of the treatments that we talk about in this episode. The brain is a funny thing. And when it's damaged, it needs to have some work done and needs to have a tune-up done, just like emotions need to have tune-up. The brain needs a physical tune-up at times. And that's what we get into on this episode. So I need to get in and I need to do a tune-up, more of an emotional tune-up than anything. And I need to have a talk with a therapist, my therapist, and I need to have her say to me as bluntly as possible, stop. You know what you're doing. Just fucking stop. And I need to hear her say that once in a while. And I've neglected that. I've only done it once since I left at the end of February, and that's on me. That's my fault. This shit doesn't stop when you step away from the fire service or whatever career you have. It stays there, and then you have more time on your hands. And when you get more time on your hands, you think about it more and you ruminate on it, and it eats at you a little bit. And then you get in your head and you lose these connections that you had every other day or every third day, going in there and laughing about it and having that therapy session at the kitchen table or in the back of a rig. You lose that connection. And it's a very important connection. And so what I think I need to do is I need to establish a group of people who are maybe stepped away or getting ready to step away, or and just say, okay, hey, let's meet virtually once a week and we'll just talk about it. Tell me trials, tribulations, your successes, your failures, and let me tell you mine. And let's laugh. Maybe let's laugh at something inappropriate and let's make some jokes that maybe get us fired in the civilian world. I don't care. You can't offend me. But I think that's a part missing in my life that I'm going to have to figure out a way to fulfill it. And I think that's one part of it. And I can do that. I can add that into my life, into this post-fire service gig of mine. But I also need to stay on top of it. I need to stay on top of what I call mental health and mental wealth. Welcome to episode 130 of The Things We All Carry. Today's show is with Dr. Brooke Bartlett. Brooke is a clinical psychologist, and I put out a call for knowledge, basically. I had a conversation with Stephanie White of the 5 After Midnight podcast, and that talk was centered around why are we still killing ourselves as firefighters? Why do we do it? With everything we know, with the stigma being reduced, with mental health being more prevalent, why are we still killing ourselves? And it came down to this for me. Talk therapy is not enough. We have to figure out what damage is actually being done in the brain, what physical damage is done in the brain. And this is where Dr. Brooke comes in. We have a great conversation. We talk about areas of the brain that are damaged, how they interact with each other, what emotions they might cause, and how it might manifest itself, and what you would see on the outside, what she calls the roots and the leaves of a tree. We also talk about some of the treatments to fix the physical damage so then you can get to the emotional stuff a little better. And then you'll be more open to talk therapy, and it might be more valuable to you. I'm not saying do away with talk therapy. I'm saying it's not enough in some cases. And we'll get into that in the show when it's not enough. Listen, if you hear yourself in this episode, reach out. Find somebody that can work with you. I get you in touch with someone. Reach out to Dr. Brooke Bartlett. She can get you in touch with somebody, but reach out. There's work to be done that will fix what's going on up there and allow you to be open to more of the benefits of talk therapy and the benefits of life in general, to be honest with you. So this was a really good conversation. It's informative. It's fascinating. It gets into the brain. It gets into how to fix some parts of the brain. And this was a good one. I really enjoyed this conversation because I learned during this conversation. And I love those episodes where I get to learn. So you guys sit back and enjoy episode 130 of The Things We All Carry with Dr. Brooke Bartlett, and then get out there and do something for yourself. Do this?
Let's do it.
All right. I'm trying not to make a fool of myself, but I can't guarantee you. So welcome back to The Things We All Carry. Today, I'm honored and excited to have Dr. Brooke Bartlett on with me, and she is going to talk to us all about our brains. And if any of us know where we have issues, most of us in the fire department, fire service, police department, wherever, know that we have some issues up there. We get some patterns of thought and some tracks of thought, and it's hard to get out of them. And I kind of wanted to ask her why we get that and how we quote unquote fix it. We all know we don't fix ourselves, but we can moderate the damage in some manner. And her name was thrown out to me, and then she reached out to me and has graciously agreed to be on. So I'll let her introduce herself a little bit, where she comes from, and what she studied and what she's doing now. So,
hey, yeah, thanks for having me. I'm doing great. So I'm a clinical psychologist, which just basically means I spent way too long in school and training to get to put the word psychologist over my title. So a little bit about my background is that I started off doing research with military and working specifically with veterans and special operation forces. Heavy trauma research background, really went down the route of just fully specializing in trauma and anxiety, and was on course to just be a purely military psychologist. But what actually ended up getting me into specializing and working with first responders was that when I started my PhD program, which was in Houston, Texas, I had the opportunity to actually work with the Houston Fire Department, which was at the time one of only 3 fire departments in the U.S. with staff psychologists. which is crazy. And I don't think that number's changed much. To the best of my knowledge, maybe like 6, 7 now.
I'd be very surprised if it's changed
Yeah.
much.
So I jumped, I mean, this was literally day one when I got to Houston. So I jumped right in and immersing myself in first responder culture. So I spent all 6 years of my doctoral training, um, working closely not only with the Houston Fire Department, but ended up expanding into other departments throughout the country. I was on call 24/7. I was there at the promotions. I was there at the funerals. I was there for therapy. I helped develop a mental wellness program, also developed a research program there as well. So, conducted a lot of research with first responders, primarily firefighter, EMS throughout the country, focused on things like trauma, substance use, suicidality, resiliency factors, etc. So, um, after I finished my residencies here in San Diego. Takes about 15 years to become a psychologist. It's just kind of never ending.
It's
Um,
yeah, it's never ending.
but yeah, after I finished my residency, I opened up my own practice, my own business, Center for Trauma, Anxiety, and Stress, where I primarily work with first responders and public safety agencies, doing a variety of things: peer support programming, critical incident response, mental wellness programming, therapy, and so on and so forth. So it's a little bit of a highlight reel of how I got to where I am now.
Well, it's interesting that when we first talked, you talked about Houston, and it stood out to me because I and the listeners kind of got a glimpse into Houston because of a couple of guests, and it 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 was a prime spot to have a good examination of the stressors of being a firefighter,
Mhm.
because they had a lot of different stressors, not just the calls, but they had a lot of internal
I
stressors as
did.
well. The city, I mean, for lack of a better term, fucked them over at one point, and so you had to deal with that,
Yep.
deal with the calls, and deal with home life. So you've got it's just a melting pot and a witch's brew of shit that came down on them.
It sure was, and I was there at kind of the heart of that time as well over those few years when yeah, they did get pretty fucked over by the city. I agree. So there was a lot of organizational stressors, external stressors on top of obviously the stressors of the job itself. And in a city like Houston, so Houston at the time had about 4,000 staff, and is one of the fire departments where all firefighters are also trained EMS. And Houston's a big city, third largest city in the country. And so many of the stations that these guys and gals were at, I mean, they're running calls all night. I mean,
Yes.
they don't stop when they're on shift. And then turnover, understaffing leads to mandated overtime. So a lot of these guys and gals were working insane amounts and picking up shifts elsewhere too, just
Oh, yeah.
weekends meet. So there's a lot going into that.
Yeah, I think, people don't realize that. Houston's the 3rd largest city in the country, and they weren't afforded, a living wage in some cases.
Yeah.
And it's just mind blowing to me.
Mhm.
It's and I won't we don't need to go down a rabbit hole too much. If people want to get a glimpse of Houston, go listen to either Cody or Stephen Sims episode, because they'll get into the inner workings of Houston a bit. But it is it was a prime place for you to cut your teeth. That's for damn sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I kind of want to ask a couple of questions, and these are random because I wanted to get your opinion between kind of this military approach to mental health and this first responder approach to mental health, because I think it's kind of like almost a Venn diagram, because you have some overlap, but then there's some speciality to these traumas
Yeah.
between military and first responder.
Mhm.
Like, and how would you discern the differences or the similarities there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Culturally, more similar than different, in
Hmm.
terms of aspects like camaraderie, um, strength, all the good parts of the culture, right? I always tell people the culture, first responder culture, I'm never going to like shit on it and say, oh, these are the things, right? But just like anything, too much of it can become a problem.
Right.
But things like camaraderie, tradition, pride, strength, always being strong, always being the protector, all those aspects of the culture, I think overlap, as do the other sides, the darker sides of it as well. I think overlap a lot. In terms of trauma, it really depends. We're talking about combat veterans, versus a first responder. Their trauma exposure, at least in modern day warfare, will be really different than trauma exposure of a first responder. I think in terms of operational aspects, a couple of the biggest differences that I've noticed are really related to reintegration. So for your military, they're getting deployed for 6 to 12 months. They're completely removed from home, which is very difficult,
Yeah.
and comes with its own struggles, but they're not having to also kind of go on shift for 3 days, come back home. Now I'm mom, dad, whoever, partner, and now I'm back on the job. And now I'm coming back here. Whereas the first responder is kind of having to constantly switch back and forth between these
Right.
roles. And again, I don't think either of them is harder or easier. They just come with different difficulties, I think. So I would say that is one of the biggest differences between that I've seen in working with both aspects. And then that approach is a little bit different in terms of how we best manage and mitigate the difficulties in that with family members, partners, children, etc. Because approaching it with a firefighter who's going on and off shift versus someone who's deploying for 12 months, that's going to be a different approach, a little bit different.
Yeah, I can imagine. And that's kind of that's how I envisioned it. And it's kind of like, it's almost in my head, I see a drip, for firefighters or first responders, this trauma drip,
Mhm.
right? It's coming daily.
Yeah.
Boom, boom, boom. Where it's just this shower head or a nozzle for military combat veterans who have been in the shit, I
One-
guess we can say. And that's kind of like just being hit with opening the bail on a nozzle and letting it flow. And then it shuts down and you return to normal.
Yeah.
Whereas a firefighter or a cop or whatever, or even a dispatcher is getting that drip. And it's just that slow
Yeah.
build.
Yes, I agree. And the other aspect too, a major aspect, is we're talking about the role of someone in the military versus the role of, let's say, a firefighter. Military, of course, you may have to take someone's life, right?
Yeah.
Same goes for the differences even in the first responder world between police versus
Mhm.
firefighter. But that takes on a different toll. Um, and firefighter, though, has to always typically is I need to save, I need to help. I'm in charge of this person's life. And if this person doesn't live, then it's on me. Right. So there's a lot more, I think, a lot more emphasis in the firefighter world. And this gets to moral injury, which I'm not sure if you've had people talk about on your show
Oh yeah.
yet, but moral injury is rampant in military and
Yeah.
first responders. But I find that the source of it tends to differ overall, generally speaking, between
Mhm.
military and if we're talking about firefighter, EMS, paramedic, um, where the military moral injury could be a lot more so related to, um, carrying out certain missions, having to take lives. It's interesting. I've worked with a lot of special operation forces, and um, it, it it's never easy to kill even the bad guy, right? They don't cry themselves to sleep about it necessarily in the same way, like they feel like what they did was wrong, but it's still typically not very easy to do that. And
Mhm.
most of the time with my SOFs, I've found that the moral injury almost comes from what comes after that. So, for example, I worked with someone who, had to eliminate a kid that was, pointing a rocket launcher at them, and he wasn't necessarily really affected by the fact that they had to eliminate the kid, because it was like he would have taken out my whole unit. But it was more so he kind of talked about, well, that's a bummer that we had to do that, and he got chastised for it. Oh, do you like terrorists now? Oh, do you feel bad for kind of
Right.
like the falling out of that as well.
Yeah.
So I find there's a lot of difficulty around that, which is similar to first responders as well. There's a lot of
Yeah.
moral injury around that too, which is getting made fun of for actually being affected by a call or being afraid to show
Yeah.
that you're affected by a call, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the way I was tending to think about it, and it's interesting because there are some similarities, and then there are vast
Mhm.
differences as well. So it's interesting to hear when I talk to someone whose background is military. It's interesting to hear how they approach it.
Mhm.
So that's why I just when you brought it up, I figured I'd go down a little rabbit hole there.
Yeah. I love rabbit holes.
So speaking of rabbit holes, what's the last song you heard?
Last song I heard would be System of a Down, Atwa.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. You working out?
I wasn't. That's just kind of like,
Okay.
I was just kind of getting started with my day. Well, technically I was getting ready for physical therapy. I go on Wednesday morning. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Very nice. All right. So what is a brain and why do I need to know about it as a firefighter?
The brain. That's a very broad-based question. Well, the brain's very
Isn't it?
important. I can tell you that. The brain, the importance of being a firefighter and knowing about the brain is understanding what's actually going on underneath the surface,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because when we're talking about mental health, we can't see it.
No,
We can't see it.
not at all.
We know
Yeah.
we feel like shit. We know we've had a short fuse. We know we've been isolated more. We know we've felt disconnected. We know we're not doing things that we normally enjoy doing, but we don't see it. We see the outcome. I talk about like the leaves on the tree, like all that I just mentioned. Those are the leaves on the tree, but we don't actually see, oh yeah, I have a fracture. Like all this pain, this limitation in my arm is because I have a fracture here. And I can
Mhm.
see that. Look, I have my x-ray, right? We don't see it. So it's really important to talk about the brain and understand what's going on in the brain because it provides, I think it does a lot of things. I think it addresses the stigma associated with mental health because believe it or not, there are a lot of things actually going on underneath the surface. But it also provides people with, I think it's empowering in the sense that, okay, now I kind of understand why I'm doing this. It's not just this amorphous thing that I'm just doing just because and that I'm too weak to stop, for example.
Right.
So I think it really provides that knowledge is power. And understanding that can then be more motivating for someone to maybe get the help that they need, right? It can allow them to maybe engage more in doing things, knowing why doing that thing it can help them. Because we're more likely to do things when we know why, right?
Right. When you explain the benefit.
Exactly. Exactly. If I'm going to PT, which I am, having someone just say, do this, and this, like, why? No,
Yeah.
why am I doing this? What's going on? Like, why is my neck and my back hurting? Right. So that's the really important part of why firefighters should know a little bit more about the brain.
So speaking of knowing more about the brain, what parts of the brain, yeah, exactly that. What parts of the brain should we be very concerned about as first responders or military and how how the trauma and the things we see affect those parts of our brain?
Yeah. So there's typically three main players that I like to talk about when we're talking about trauma and how it impacts our brain. And it's the amygdala, which I think you mentioned when we met last time, the
Hmm.
prefrontal cortex, and our hippocampus. Have you talked much or learned much about those other two aspects of the brain?
I mean, on my own,
Yeah.
yes, those are I've read about and done some study in school about, but not on the show. We
Okay.
haven't.
Well, you want to talk a little bit about what they do?
Let's let's get into it.
Okay. So the amygdala. What do you know about the amygdala or what it does?
From if I remember correctly, the amygdala is, and I'm probably going to butcher this completely. Now you put me on a spot. This is unfair. Um, is it regulating emotion?
Nope, that's actually prefrontal cortex.
Oh, prefrontal. Okay.
So our
Eh,
amygdala, it has one job and one job only, to keep us alive. That is all it
Okay.
does. It's one of very few brain structures that has kind of like one job. Many of our
Hmm.
other brain structures, they multitask. They have a lot of very important jobs. Our amygdala, it really hasn't evolved too much over time. It's the alarm system in our brain,
Hmm.
right? Lets us know when there's a threat.
It's the hair standing up on the back of my neck.
Exactly. It's when you're driving and someone cuts you off and you have to slam on your brakes and your heart's beating, your
Hmm.
amygdala is setting that
Okay.
off. Okay. So one job and one job only to keep us alive. The prefrontal cortex has many important jobs. Okay. Um, One is regulating our emotions. This is where all of our logical reasoning occurs, right? Logical reasoning, where we're able to actually take a step back, think through things, make the best decision possible. When we're not logically reasoning very well, what do you think comes to the forefront when we're not actually thinking through decisions and we're making decisions quickly? What do you think comes to the forefront?
As in what does the actions for us?
Yeah, what do
Or
you like? So, when we're talking about logical reasoning, the opposite of logical reasoning would be making very hasty decisions, right?
yeah, so those rash decisions that all, well, not all, I hate saying all, but most firefighters are known to make.
Yeah, impulsivity.
Mm-hmm.
Ever known a firefighter to be impulsive?
No, none at all. No,
Yeah,
not me by any means.
yeah. So, that's up here is where all that logical reasoning happens, regulates our emotion. There's actually been, I don't know if you remember the famous case or if you've heard of the famous case. This is from many, many decades ago. But a guy who had a rod accidentally go
Mm.
through his brain.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it completely changed him, meaning like his personality was completely different because it really damaged that prefrontal cortex. His mood was completely different. His emotions were completely different because of that significant, needless to say, that's significant traumatic brain injury when you have a
Yeah.
metal rod go straight through your brain.
Mm.
So prefrontal cortex, super, super important. Another really important part of the prefrontal cortex has another important job. It tells the amygdala to turn off. It says we're good, right? Puts the brakes on the amygdala. Because remember, amygdala, one job: danger, danger,
Yeah.
danger, 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 right? Prefrontal cortex, all right, we've assessed the threat. Oh, false
Right.
alarm, you can turn down. Or the threat has passed, you can turn down, right? It's the brake system for the amygdala. Pretty important, right?
It's very important.
Hippocampus, little part in our brain. This is the memory center of our brain. Okay. I like to think of it as a nice big filing cabinet. It allows us not only to put new files in there, but it allows us to retrieve other files, right? So memory, storage, and consolidation. So we're talking
Mhm.
about both short-term and long-term memory. So not only that we can put new information in there, but that we can recall other information. It helps us properly process and sort out these memories and information. That's what the hippocampus does.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
And so, and I'm probably jumping ahead, but I've got questions just jumping around. And so in the middle of trauma and you have a memory, you're that's where you're not storing that stuff correctly, or it's not being processed correctly before being stored.
So you're saying in
Am
the
I on the
middle of
right track?
trauma, like as the trauma's happening, or are you talking about in the aftermath?
In the aftermath.
Yes, that is what is happening. Correct. Um, so let's talk about each of those brain structures with post-traumatic stress injury. Okay?
Yes, please, let's.
So we have an amygdala that's only job
Mhm.
is to let us know that there's danger. What happens to the amygdala with post-traumatic stress injury is it becomes overreactive.
Mhm.
It starts firing all the time, even when there's no actual threat present. So it's going, 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 going. Think about a car alarm. What's the purpose of a car alarm?
Right, to alert.
To alert, right? Someone's breaking into our car, someone's messing with our car alarm goes off, and we can go and assess the threat, right?
Right.
So, what happens with post traumatic stress injury is that car alarm is going off when no one's trying to break into the car. It's going
Yeah.
off when someone's walking by with their dog, when there's another car that drives by, when there's fireworks nearby. We've all probably been somewhere where someone's car alarm is just nonstop going off, right? That's what happens to our amygdala. It is going off all the time, even when it doesn't need to. Okay. Here's the other thing about the amygdala. Because it has arguably probably the most important job, which is to keep us alive, it is the loudest. Okay. When it
Makes
is
sense.
on, it completely suppresses other parts of the brain. Some completely. It completely compresses them. Some it just very much disables them and keeps them from doing what they're fully able to do. So when our amygdala is on, it is screaming the loudest and the other parts of our brain get toned down. Okay. Prefrontal cortex. So we have an overreactive amygdala. What happens to the prefrontal cortex is it actually becomes underreactive.
Mm-hmm.
The neuronal branching in our prefrontal cortex starts to diminish. Okay. And so we have an overreactive amygdala, an underreactive prefrontal cortex. We already talked about all
Mm-hmm.
the important things that a prefrontal cortex is supposed to do, including turning off the amygdala. But guess what? Lights are off up here. Well,
Right.
the amygdala has full reign.
Right. Yeah.
Hypervigilance, 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 hypervigilance. Anyone who suffered from post-traumatic stress injury probably knows that they're used to being hypervigilant. It's difficult
Mhm.
to sometimes even enjoy doing enjoyable things because I'm on guard all the time.
It's kind of what we talked about before we started recording.
Sure was. Yep, exactly. So then we have that hippocampus, right? With post-traumatic stress injury, our hippocampus literally shrinks. It gets smaller. Okay. And because it gets smaller, needless to say, it's not able to work the way it's supposed to. So that nice filing cabinet I was telling you about,
Right.
all the files are all over the place.
Yeah.
They're all over the ground. There's drawers pulled out. Everything is completely discombobulated. Okay. Another very important job of our hippocampus is it allows us to differentiate between past and present. Now, here's what I mean by that. Okay. There's something that we are capable of doing because of our brain that we take for granted. What we're able to do is if I am presented with something that reminds me of something in my past, my
Right.
brain is able to tell me that was then and this is now, right? Whether it be a good thing or a bad thing, right? When our hippocampus is really, really not functioning optimally, what happens is our brain, it's not able to actually distinguish those things. So let's talk about someone with post-traumatic stress injury. Anyone who's listening who's had post-traumatic stress injury or has known someone, you might have noticed that they've experienced a smell, they've seen something that reminds them of some past trauma, and their body reacts as if they're in that threat right now.
Mm-hmm.
So let's use the stereotypical example, but which does occur is let's talk about a combat veteran that I worked with a lot of them that the smell of barbecue was a trigger for them. Okay, because they'd smell a lot of burnt bodies. So they are going to a barbecue in 2024, and they smell that, and all of a sudden their heart rate goes up. They start trembling. They start feeling very unsafe and they're like, I need to get out of here. I can't stay at this family event. And they leave, right? Because their hippocampus is not properly functioning. They're not psychotic. They know they're not actually back in Iraq right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
But their body is reacting as if you're in Iraq right now. That's a threat. That's a threat. That's a
Yeah.
threat. So the amygdala is firing,
Yeah.
even though there's no threat.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Because all the wires are crossed. And so, like you said, it's wanting to believe it's one spot. And so the amygdala believes it because the other part of the brain is telling you it is.
Yeah. So we have an overreactive amygdala, an underreactive prefrontal cortex, a shrunken hippocampus. Let's talk about the symptoms of post-traumatic stress injury, right? These are the leaves on the tree. The symptoms are the leaves. Everything we just talked about is the actual root of the tree. So we have
Mm-hmm.
anger, short fuse, outbursts, irritability. We have hypervigilance. We have a startle response. We have sleep disturbances, disconnectedness, emotions that go from being completely numb to being pissed off to being numb to not feeling anything, right? We can't remember things. We have intrusions popping up, images, thoughts, memories, sounds of that event popping up in our brain, right? All of that is happening because of everything I just talked about in the brain. Those are just the leaves, but those are the symptoms of post-traumatic stress injury that are being caused by an overactive amygdala, an underreactive prefrontal cortex, and a shrunken hippocampus.
Right. And that's literally physical damage.
Physical damage. So here's the other thing I want your listeners to know. Brain scans, they exist.
Yes.
Okay. Now, unfortunately, they're not super accessible. So I can't just go to my primary care practitioner and say, hey, can I get a brain scan? I want to see
Right.
what's going on in there. But most brain scans uh, are conducted in research studies. Most of them, large majority of them are conducted in research studies. But when we look, I wish I could show you right now, but I have some side by side of brains of with post traumatic stress injury and those without post traumatic stress injury.
Hmm.
We see things like the prefrontal cortex when we're looking at um, brain scans that look at the actual matter of the brain, the volume of the brain.
Right.
See that the prefrontal cortex is acquiesced. It's not showing up the way it's supposed to. When we look
Right.
at SPECT scans, what SPECT scans do is they don't look at they don't measure matter or volume. They measure the reactivity in the brain. So basically things like oxygen flow and blood flow, right? What individuals or what researchers will do is they will run participants, some diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, others not. And they will show them triggers, right? So whatever their triggers are, the individual without post-traumatic stress, their brain will not be going into fight or flight mode. Their
Right.
brain sees that and says, that's a picture. That's not happening right now. The individual with post-traumatic stress, what will happen is their brain will go into full fight or flight mode. We see all the activity in the brain, the increased blood flow, the increased oxygen flow. It looks very discombobulated because that's where our brain looks when our brain is going, danger, danger, right? So these brain scans exist. All right. This is our, oh, my elbow is fractured. That's why it's hurting. We just don't see it. We unfortunately can't turn our eyeballs inward and scan our brain and say, oh, I'm seeing that injury going on right there.
It's interesting that you bring that up because I had a conversation and I recorded a show with the gentleman who wrote a book, and he's a former Dayton, Ohio firefighter, and he had a brain scan done,
Mhm.
and he sent me the preliminary results before we had our discussion, and his brain was doing exactly what you were saying right now.
Mhm.
And he thought there's no way that I'm still experiencing stuff because he hasn't run a call for 2.5 years. He's like, there's no way. He goes,
Mhm.
I found out that day that my brain is permanently fight or flight right
Mhm.
now, and is nothing that I can do right now to change it. He goes, what it was so beneficial to have my wife and other family members there to hear that and go, this is a physical manifestation of the trauma,
Mhm.
and we have to work on that physical part before he can start to change, as you say, the leaves on the
Mhm.
tree.
Wow.
And so then his family go, "Ah, I get it now."
Yeah.
Now and it's exactly what you said. Okay, now they see the injury because the scan shows the injury.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, the unfortunate part is this is why I think it's so important that we're talking about this now. I present on this a lot in departments across the country because it's unfortunate that we need the brain scan to understand that. Yeah, or to
Right,
believe it. I should say not understand, to believe it. That's the big part, right?
right.
Oh, so and so is, he's having to take leave because, it's like
Yeah,
he can't cut it, he can't cut it. He's not doing great anymore, right? Is that we need to see those brain scans and say like, oh shit, you
yeah,
actually
yeah.
stuff actually going on in there, right?
Right.
Um, it's important to know with brain scans two things. One, they on their own, they're not used as a diagnostic tool. They're used as a
Mhm.
very important adjunctive piece of data, right? Meaning
Right,
that, if someone if someone with post traumatic stress injury went and got their brain scanned without any other evaluation or anything, you don't look at it and go, oh, yep, look at that.
right,
You have PTSD, right? It's not like getting tested for COVID, right?
right.
It's used to say, okay, this person has this history, we have this trauma background, they are showing these symptoms, full psychological evaluation coupled with the brain scans is used to say, okay, yep, this all matches up. This is what we see with someone
Exactly.
with post-traumatic stress injury, right? And they're used to also track recovery, right? So we don't go in there just to get a brain scan and say, yep, that's it. That's what you have. But they're a very, very important piece of information so that we can actually see what's going on underneath the surface.
I wanna go back to the hippocampus.
And I know we'll talk more about all of this. And it's a curiosity thing for me because you said that's where the memory, short and long term memories are stored, correct?
Yeah.
And so when you couple those memories with traumatic events or periods in life that are overwhelming, those memories are still there. Even though you say, okay, I have gaps of memory in my life, the memories are still there. I don't I don't know how what exactly I'm trying to ask. Like, how do you go in and say you kind of rediscover those memories, right?
Mhm.
With certain treatments. And so what there's got to be this balancing act between you rediscovering memories and then creating what you think would the memory be. Does that make sense?
So there's typically, yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. So there's typically two, I'll call them types. When I'm working with post traumatic stress injury. So one symptom of post traumatic stress disorder is that someone might have actual gaps in their memory
Hmm.
about the trauma. I mean, these are gaps that they reasonably should be able to remember. I worked with a firefighter who responded to a call that was actually a family member of his who
Mm.
ended up dying on scene. And he cannot, remember for the life of him, he couldn't remember for the life of him, like what she was wearing, what day it was, just certain things, no matter how hard he tried to remember, right? So gaps in the memory like that. But then there's others. I had a firefighter recently say, I can remember every single detail of every difficult call I've been on, but I can't remember what I had for dinner last night,
You're right.
right? So some individuals have very vivid, clear memories of those tough incidents that, are really sticking with them. Others might have those gaps. While some really struggle with the day to day. I just cannot keep anything in my brain anymore. So yeah, those are kind of the different types. So when we're talking about, and I'm sure we'll get more into this, but evidence-based trauma therapy, a part of that is to help the hippocampus, rebuild the hippocampus so that we can allow it to actually consolidate and store those memories properly. Um, and I think there's a couple different mechanisms to it, depending on if someone's more of I have gaps in my memory about that stuff versus I'm just day to day. I can't focus. I can't concentrate. You can tell me one thing and 5 minutes later, I've forgotten it.
And I mean, there are people that have had trauma through childhood that have gaps in
Yep.
just, I mean, childhood memories in general for chunks of time.
Mhm.
And it's not just around the event or events that they experienced. It is literally, hey, I don't remember second grade
Yeah.
at all.
Mhm. Yes. It can be extremely, um, the gaps in memory can be not necessarily just in one moment in time. They can last and we're not talking about like unconscious memories. That's not really the way it works, where it's like, oh, these are just completely unconscious. But our brain, everything our body and our brains have developed to do is just to protect us, right? Survival.
Hmm.
And so what starts to happen is, I think of it as like those aspects, those details get buried underneath a lot of the other effects of the trauma. Well, it's not that
Oh,
they're not there. It's just we have to start kind of like dusting off all the shit
yeah.
on top of it so that that can then be properly stored.
I get what you see. That I think that's exactly what I was asking. So they're there.
Hmm.
They're just muted and hidden.
Hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Hmm.
Cool. I think that's exactly where I was going with that with, well, whatever kind of logic I had in that question.
I picked up what you were putting down. Yeah.
Yeah, but you also have like 20 years of schooling behind it, so that's your job to pick up on what I'm mumbling about. Um, all right, so those are the 3 main sections of the brain that we need to deal with when we talk about trauma and PTSD. And you've kinda laid out really well for those of us in the, like, crayon eating world here that, how they affect each other. How the hell do we fix it?
Yeah. So
And that's the big question, right? That how do we fix it? And
and I'll preface this conversation with the fact that this is why you and I came together to talk, is because I had a discussion with somebody one day, and the question was, all right, we know firefighters are killing themselves, and we know kind of the why they're killing themselves in general, but why do we keep doing it?
Mm-hmm.
Even though we know there's an issue going on and people are trying to fix it, but we're bringing it to the forefront. We're talking about it. We're getting therapy, but we're still killing ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Why? And I couldn't answer the question for her, and I don't think anybody can really necessarily answer that question for her. But it hit me, and this is me going, "Oh, I've got a great moment," but it's not. It was just my own great moment, because then it hit me that no, this is physical trauma, and talk therapy isn't doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I found you.
Yeah.
So is talk therapy enough?
No, talk
Okay.
therapy is not enough. So here's the thing. Mental health is on a spectrum, just like most things, even in our physical health. Okay. Unless we're talking about type 1 diabetes, or someone's born with type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes isn't just, you're not healthy this day and the next day you wake up and you have type 2 diabetes, right?
You work for it.
Yeah, exactly. Mental health is the same way. You don't just wake up the next day with PTSD, right? Or you don't just wake up the next day with an alcohol use disorder, right? So what's important to understand is that there's this spectrum. Once someone passes a certain threshold on the post-traumatic stress spectrum, talk therapy is no longer a good option. Once someone meets criteria for post-traumatic stress, okay, and that post-traumatic stress, they're not only meeting the symptom criteria, but another couple important determinants is how much impairment those symptoms are causing them in their life. Now, these symptoms have become they're unmanageable. It's affecting my marriage. I'm not able to do my job as well as I'm not used to be able to. My physical health is deteriorating, right? How much impairment those symptoms are causing them and how much distress they're causing them, okay? Once someone passes that threshold and is more in they're meeting criteria, full criteria, or they're close to meeting criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're, like I said, having a lot of impairment, at that point, talk therapy is not going to do it. Okay.
Mhm.
Because talk therapy is not evidence-based and designed to address those aspects of the brain that I just talked to you about. Okay. I think in our, when we met, I said something like, if someone was diagnosed with cancer, do you think that going to support groups is the best line, the
Right.
first line of treatment for cancer? And you just kind of laughed like, no, of course not. Right. Now,
Right.
support groups, excellent additive. I'm not shitting on support
Yeah.
groups or anything like that. Could be extremely beneficial for someone who's also treating their cancer. Right. But that
Mhm.
alone is not going to make the cancer go away. Right.
Right.
So when we're talking about post-traumatic stress and when someone's past that threshold, it's a similar idea. We need actual targeted treatment for that post-traumatic stress to recalibrate the brain so that it's operating more optimally, more functionally. Okay. Um, Before I go into talking more about the mechanisms of change in evidence-based trauma therapy, why don't we talk about neuroplasticity?
Let's do it.
Okay.
What is it? People throw the word around, and I have my definition of it, but what is it?
So one thing I want your listeners to be very, very, very clear on is none of this is actually permanent. Okay. It's not permanent. That's super important to understand, because that idea that I'm so fucked up and I'm going to stay this way is detrimental. Okay.
Mhm.
When we're talking about, there's a lot of different things, accumulation of things that I can come on and talk about at a different time that lead to suicide. Right. But I can tell you
Mhm.
that the idea is I'm stuck like this and I'm never going to get better is a factor. Right.
Right.
Our brains are designed to change. They are malleable. They are designed that way. Okay. And we are all born with a superpower called neuroplasticity. All right. So, neuroplasticity allows our brain, the actual structural part of our brain and the functional part of our brain to change. Okay. So like I just said, there's structural versus functional. So structural neuroplasticity, our brain is actually capable, say we actually have some kind of traumatic brain injury, like
Mm-hmm.
military vet, drove over an IED, got knocked out, actual damage to part of the brain, right? Structural neuroplasticity allows either the healing of that part of the brain that was injured, or let's say the part of the brain was injured pretty badly. What it does is it actually tries to increase the strengths in other parts of the brain to try and make up for what might be, what might not be doing so well in that part of the brain that was damaged.
Right.
Make sense?
Yeah. You find another area of the brain that can compensate for the extreme damage.
Exactly. Then we have functional neuroplasticity, and that's probably people have heard about, the wiring and firing, right? That's our actual neurons, our neural connections. So our brain, we have the physical part of our brain that we've seen brains before, and brains on different things. We have a physical brain and all these different structures I talked about. But
Mhm.
inside those structures, inside our brain, there's all these neural connections, neurons, right? And the way these neurons are connected really determine not only our behavior and how we feel, but how we think as well.
Mhm.
Okay. So, what functional neuroplasticity allows is, say let's even just talk about someone has clinical depression. Okay. So, they're really suffering from depression. What treatment can help them do is their brain to actually rewire some of those neural connections to start firing in a way that's more optimal. Okay. So it's not necessarily like structural neuroplasticity is not necessarily just completely wiping out those other neural connections and just placing in new ones. But I heard a neuroscientist once say it's almost like train tracks. So you
Mhm.
have these train tracks. These train tracks aren't working well. They're sending trains off the rails. What we want to do is build new train tracks on top of it, right? And that's kind of more what functional neuroplasticity does. Okay. So it's
Ye
super, super important to understand that these injuries to our brain are not permanent.
Well, and that's funny because I think most people through their life have heard, "Oh, if you cause yourself some brain damage, you're never getting that back." Especially Jesus, I'll date myself growing up in the "just say no" era, with Nancy Reagan saying, "Just say no to drugs," because here's your
Well,
brain
yes.
on drugs and the fried egg
Yeah.
thing, and you're killing it off, and you'll never get it back. Well, we've come to find out that's bullshit because the brain is so adaptive with what you just talked about, neuroplasticity,
hmm Yeah.
that it's just amazing organ that I mean, even you have studied it for what, 12, 16 years. You've barely probably scratched the
Well, yeah,
surface of what the brain
for
is.
sure. Yeah.
And I guess I think, and I might be completely off base here, but my thinking has gone with the brain being these distinct chambers of the brain,
Mhm.
right? To more of like a forest analogy where that root system is underneath, and that's what the pathways of neurons are, is a root system. And then when this root is damaged, this root will grow or refire in a way
Yeah.
to keep that part of the forest alive.
Yes. Absolutely. I love that analogy. I might steal that. Yeah, the forest analogy.
I'm gonna copyright it. You can't take it.
Yes, that's a great way to think about it. Now, there are cases, the the famous case I told you about where a metal
Mhm.
rod, I mean, he should have been dead. It's a famous case because the guy lived and
Yes.
he literally had a metal rod go straight through his brain, right?
Yeah, I've seen the picture of that hole in his head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
At that point, structural neuroplasticity, that's going to be really tough to make up for, right?
Well, and it take into account when that happened too, and they probably didn't think you could
Yeah.
retrain at that point, and so it would take a hell of a lot even today to do
Yeah.
compared to what was that? Was that early
Yeah.
1900s?
It was early 1900s. Yeah.
So think there. I mean, shit, they were cutting halves of brains out
They sure
at
were.
that point in time.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So, um, now here's the other important thing to remember too when we're talking about the superpower of ours. Our superpower doesn't just happen on its own. Okay.
Hmm.
There are three ingredients that go into igniting our superpower. And I call them intentionality, repetition, and consistency. Okay. Without
Practice
those
makes
three
perfect.
things, these problems aren't going to change.
Right. Yeah.
When we're talking about evidence-based trauma therapy, we're talking about intentionality, repetition, and consistency. You're getting your reps in. Okay. I like to
Hmm.
use examples or analogies of the physical body to
Right.
mind because it's actually not different. Remember, our brain is a physical structure that is malleable. So if you've ever
Right.
been injured before, right, and you went to physical therapy, when I broke my knee, I had to wear a cast for six weeks, a splint from hip to toe, and then I had to go to physical therapy. My leg was completely atrophied at that point. Um, and it took about a year until I actually got back to fully normal, where I could run normal, where I didn't have a gait. Um, it takes a lot of practice. It doesn't just take
Right.
you going to physical therapy twice a week either. They give you things that you have to do at home on your own. So if I just
Yeah.
went to physical therapy once or twice a week and I said, all right, 1 hour, I did that and I just left, my knee's not going to get better. My leg is not going to rebuild. I'm not going to regain the strength in the other areas of my body that was lost. I'm going to probably still be walking with a gait today. Right.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing when we're talking about the brain. Good news is that the brain is malleable. These things are not permanent. Things like post-traumatic stress are not permanent. Bad news is that you actually have to do the work to utilize
Yeah.
that superpower.
Yeah. And that's a catch-22 because I mean, you're talking about people who are down,
Mhm.
who are, like you said, oh, this is never going to change. This is how it's always going to be.
Mhm.
So, why should I even try? And so then it's your job as the director of the symphony, basically, to say, no, it can change. So you have to be able to show your patients how and why.
Yes, exactly. And again, I will use the physical example. When you get an injury and you go to PT and you go to PT 2, 3, 4 times, you're not all of a sudden better, right? And that's an important expectation to have too, is that these change is possible, and it's possible, and many people recover from their severe post-traumatic stress injury, clinically significant post-traumatic stress injury, but it's not overnight. It's not in 1 week, right? It takes some time and repetition, intentionality, and consistency to make those changes. But you might be thinking this takes years. If you're engaged in trauma focused treatment and evidence based trauma focused treatment, these typically last anywhere from 2, 3, 4 months, okay, of
Hmm.
consistent engagement. So we're not talking about years. Now, I'm not saying, again, remember, we're not saying that 3 months, if you go through a full protocol trauma focused treatment, that in 3 months, you're just perfect. No, you're so great. It's like you've never been a firefighter for 20 years. You're just you're just great, right? But at that point, we're now taking you down below that threshold so that you're
Hmm.
able to regain the quality of your life again. So,
Right.
that's an important expectation to set too. Is I work with a lot of firefighters who kind of want that silver bullet, right? Like, okay, doc, what do I
Yeah.
do right now to make this go away? And when I say I don't have anything to tell you right now, they're like, "What? I thought this is what you do for work,
What good are you?
right?" That there's no silver bullet overnight. That these things take some time, but that you can get to the point where you're below that threshold and that you can re-engage with those areas in your life that's not affecting you to the same degree that it was before.
Yeah, and just and everyday quote unquote normal functioning is the goal.
Hmm.
To and I alluded to it a little bit there. Is you and I talked about it, that I had been in Montana this weekend. I was at a concert and it should have been. It was a beautiful setting, great music, and I got caught up in paying attention to what was around me in the crowd because I couldn't let it go. I just could not let it go. And I started thinking about it. It's like, man, it's ironic that it's happening to me right now when I knew that in 2 days you and I had this conversation scheduled,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and it just it played with me a lot because I was like, I know what's going on. Stop doing it, but it just wouldn't shut off.
Yeah, because logic, unfortunately, doesn't work that great against an amygdala.
Right.
It's actual recalibration of the amygdala that needs to happen. We can tell ourselves it's like telling someone with a clinically significant phobia of bridges, right? They look at the stats, they know that their chance of driving over the bridge and dying are astronomically low, but their body still goes into full fight or flight mode and they can't,
Right.
they avoid bridges like the plague, right? As they logically understand that, but it still happens. So,
All right. So neuroplasticity, this ability to quote unquote fix what's going on, to either physically reconstruct or functionally reconstruct.
Mhm.
All right. What's the toolbox?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about, we'll talk not about the session to session of what trauma focused therapy looks like, but I want to talk a little bit about the mechanisms of change. And now that we've already talked about what's going on with these parts of the brain, we can understand why we actually approach it this way. So there's 3 leading evidence-based trauma-focused treatments. EMDR, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. Now, I want to let everyone know that EMDR is not the only treatment out there. EMDR has a very good marketing. And so it seems to be the only treatment that a lot of my first responders think exists. And I've had a lot of first responders try EMDR and they didn't like it and it didn't work. And then they say, I'm screwed. This one thing that everyone talks about as the most amazing thing doesn't work for me, so I'm screwed. EMDR is not the only treatment. There's also cognitive processing therapy, CPT, and prolonged exposure, PE. Now, these are, again, the 3 gold standard treatments for post-traumatic stress injury. They have a lot of research behind it, okay? We're not talking about self-report research, meaning that someone's going to talk therapy and they fill out, how are you
Right.
feeling today? And you rate these, right? We're talking about randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials are what are needed to actually be evidence-based, okay? There's a lot of other treatments, air quote, that people are getting into out there that they're like, this is for trauma. It's not actually evidence-based. So I recommend if someone's seeking therapy to get someone who's actually trained in evidence-based treatment for trauma.
But that's not the same as trauma informed, correct?
No, it's not. I see that word
Oh,
getting
yeah.
thrown out a lot. And
Yes, and that's why I bring it up, and because I think that, and I'm not going to go as dark as to say bamboozled, but it's there's a belief that okay, that's trauma informed, so it's what you're talking about,
yeah,
and it's not there. That's a separate thing.
Nope.
It's a different designation.
It sure is. I will use the word bamboozled. I do think some people get bamboozled
Okay,
because people are trying to bamboozle them. Not everyone. Some of the
right,
people who are doing the bamboozling, unfortunately, are just trying, doing it out of trying to help people, but unfortunately are actually hurting people more. And that's also an important thing to mention too, is just the importance of going to a licensed, trained, competent person who is actually trained in utilizing these evidence-based treatments. Going to a trauma-informed coach when you have clinically significant post-traumatic stress injury, to talk to them about it, can be much more harmful than good.
okay,
And so that's also really, really important to remember, is that I don't think most people, if say they broke their knee like I did, would go to a friend who took a few anatomy classes and they're physical therapy informed, injury
right,
informed. And so I'd go to them to help me actually do that. No, you'd go to a physical therapist, right? That's actually
right,
trained in this. It's no different from the brain, right? You want to go to people who are actually trained in doing this. Trauma focused treatment is not talk therapy. It's not loosey goosey. Hey, let's just talk it through and work on that. It's very structured,
hmm,
protocol based. It takes years to get trained in doing it. I have over 3,000 hours before I could actually call myself a trauma psychologist who's competent in using that, and has been 20,000 hours put out on that. But it's really important for people to know that too. So when we're talking about the mechanisms of change, we talked about the amygdala, right? The first aspect of going in trauma focused treatment is we have to recalibrate the amygdala.
Okay.
Remember, the amygdala is built to be the loudest.
Mm-hmm.
So when our amygdala is firing all the time, going in and trying to address, let's try and address this emotion regulation, right? Let's anger, and let's try and work on that. It's not really going to do much because we need this to quiet down, the amygdala to quiet down and start firing, the way it's supposed to, before we can actually go in and address that. So the biggest mechanism of change in all three of those trauma focused treatments that I mentioned are what we call exposure, right? It's a non-avoidant approach. Okay. When I say exposure, I want to talk just very briefly so you understand how post-traumatic stress disorder or clinically significant post-traumatic stress injury develops. It does not develop overnight. If someone experiences a major trauma on Tuesday, on Wednesday, they might notice they have a lot of symptoms that look like the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. This is not considered post-traumatic stress disorder. It is normal to experience acute symptoms of post-traumatic stress in the aftermath of trauma. Okay. We're actually not allowed to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder until a certain amount of time has passed. Okay. For that.
As I understand, it's 30 days plus,
Correct.
right?
Correct. And I say that because what determines whether or not someone develops post-traumatic stress injury, more severe post-traumatic stress injury, is avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I mean by that, there's a lot of forms of avoidance, but avoiding through alcohol, kind of coping with it through alcohol, drugs, staying busy all the time. I'm not thinking, I'm doing everything I can to avoid seeing, thinking, feeling about the trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
First responders get very, very good at this. And in a way, they kind of have to, because to be good at your job, you can't really focus too much on every single call, right?
Right.
Now that's adaptive on the job. Unfortunately, it can become very unadaptive and is a risk factor for the development of more severe post-traumatic stress. So what happens when someone is not avoiding in the aftermath of trauma? Let's say they go to therapy, they talk to people about it, they reach out for support, they start doing things to regulate their nervous system, like they meditate or they go on walks, they do deep breathing, all these things together. What happens is those acute symptoms of post-traumatic stress, they start to diminish both in frequency and severity. Okay. With avoidance, what happens is these symptoms not only do not diminish, but they maintain and they worsen. Okay. Because it's completely blocking our brain's ability to actually process it properly.
Right.
So avoidance allows our amygdala to actually amp up even more. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about trauma-focused treatment, we're talking about a non-avoidant approach that's done through different forms of exposure. And those three trauma-focused treatments, they each kind of employ different forms, but they're all getting at the same mechanism of change. Does that make sense?
Okay. It does. I think it's starting to make sense. It's kind of like it's emerging from this little cloud. How about that?
Okay.
Hey guys, quick break right here just to check in and thank each of you for listening to the show. Your support has been paramount, and I appreciate all of you. I have one request, though. I need you to share the show with everyone you know. Help me get the word out and spread these stories as far and as wide as we can. While you're at it, please leave a review of the show wherever you happen to listen. Feel free to reach out to me at any time to share your story, to talk, or to pass on suggestions. Let's get on with the rest of the show.
Let's talk about habituation. Okay. When we're talking about exposure in these trauma-focused treatments, the main goal is to habituate our amygdala. How would you define habituation? Just if someone says, you need to habituate yourself to that.
You just need to get used to it. You need to you need to start making that part of the everyday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's the same with our brain and our amygdala. Okay. So an aspect of exposure is to habituate our amygdala to those trauma-related triggers. Okay.
Okay.
Remember, when someone has post-traumatic stress injury, their amygdala is firing off even when there's no actual threat. It's firing off when someone asks them about that trauma. It's firing off when they see, when they hear, I work with police officers, hear a muffler that sounds like those gunshots. It's firing off all the time, right? So we want to habituate the amygdala to these trauma-related triggers. Okay.
So that's kind of where the exposure comes in.
Yes. There's two forms of exposure that we typically do depending on what the makeup of someone's post-traumatic stress injury does. There's external exposure. So what I mean by that is we I won't go into too much detail, but we develop what's called an exposure hierarchy and say, for example, someone avoids crowded places. They only go to the same grocery store at the same time, same day of the week, 6 a.m. right when it opens because there's less people
Right.
there. I see you smiling. Maybe you're kind of familiar with this.
Yeah, I mean, I hear people say that, and
Yeah.
I think some of it is it's those comfort things that people in these jobs say, and it also it even equates to watching the same TV show over and over. It's just a comfort thing because there are no surprises.
Right. So that's external avoidance, but typically we start with what's called internal avoidance and internal exposures. Okay. And that's, imaginal exposures. Okay. And that's
Okay.
in here. That
Right.
means systematically exposing the individual to actually thinking about and talking about the trauma. This is not talk therapy. Okay. Imaginal exposures are very, very, again, systematically employed, but it's actually starting to get someone to think and talk about their trauma. And what starts to happen, if anyone who's listening has ever been to trauma-focused therapy, they probably remember when they first started doing that, it's incredibly difficult. Okay. Their body will react. They can feel nauseous. They can, their emotions can be all over the place. They'll feel really exhausted after sessions because their cortisol levels were flying off the handle because their fight or flight was going, right? But what we need to do is habituate that amygdala to actually reorient that this threat is not actually happening right now, right? Talking about this, the danger is not actually here. So what it starts to do is turn down the knob, not turn down the knob. I use the word recalibrate because what we want to do in trauma-focused treatment, I've worked with a lot of military specifically who've been like, well, doc, I want to still be able to be aware of danger. Of course,
Right.
we don't want to disable your car alarm. I still want your car alarm to go off if someone's trying to break in, but I don't want your car alarm going off when someone's just walking by, right?
Right.
So what we do is we recalibrate that amygdala so it's only firing when there's actual potential threat or real threat. And then when it assesses whether or not there's a threat and we've seen that there is a false alarm, it can actually turn off. So that's a big aspect of trauma-focused treatment is that exposure. And it's to recalibrate that amygdala so that it's not firing off all the time.
Makes sense.
Got any questions about that?
I'm sure I do, but
Just processing that now?
yeah, I think I'm just processing a bit. It makes sense to me because what you're saying is, all right, we're going to, in a way, relive this through talking about it. But we're going to do it in a setting that allows you to be comfortable and allows you to realize that it's not what's going on right now,
Yeah.
and you don't need to react to the point where you're fight or flight and you feel like you're risking life. However, when you do leave this office and you go back to shift tomorrow, and you're in a situation where it might be a Mayday situation, your amygdala is still going to work at that point in time.
Yeah. Yeah. And remember, you use the word so that you realize it's not, you logically understand that that's not happening right now, but your brain is just operating efficiently. Our brains are malleable.
Right.
Our brains are designed to change and our brains are designed to be as efficient as possible. Right. So when it kind of gets into that pattern where that amygdala is firing off like that, it's logic ain't going to do much. Right. So what these exposures help our brain do is actually those structures at amygdala to recalibrate. Because remember, when we think about what leads to the development of clinically significant post-traumatic stress injury, It's avoidance. So when individuals come in for trauma-focused treatment, it's not like they've actually been talking about these things. They've actually done everything they can to
Yeah.
avoid seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling, and remembering about that stuff, right? So what these exposures do is we actually have them very much talk about it in a lot of detail, very specific detail in a very specific way. So not just like broadly, oh, I woke up and then I heard the
Mhm.
sounds and I went out and my unit was on the ground. I mean, we're talking about what they smell, every single detail of what they saw, right? I mean, we're really opening those aspects up and the amygdala is firing, 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 firing. But over time, we don't do it just once. We don't do it just twice. We do it over and over and over again until their subjective units of distress, we call them SUDs, but basically their anxiety levels start to go down. Once they start to go down, now we're seeing that amygdala is recalibrating and is not actually firing because it's sensing danger when someone's thinking about their trauma.
Yeah, that makes sense. That definitely makes sense when it was said like that, and, like, it's that and I know it's in the name, it's that repetition
Mhm.
that's okay, I'm stumbling for the word, it's for lack of a better term, you get used to it.
Mhm. Yep. Yeah.
Hmm,
Absolutely. Your amygdala starts to get used to it. Yeah. That's a good way to put it. I mean, it gets used to it. It is able to realize that is not the threat. That is not the threat. Right. So it's you're able to talk about it and your amygdala is not firing at that time. So when we're talking about habituation, the important, again, I wish I could bring up some of my data charts to kind of show you what happens, but we're thinking about a graph, um, and the x-axis on the bottom is the amount of time you're in that exposure, and the y-axis going up and down is the level of distress, those SUDs I talked about. What we
Right.
see with over time, over exposures, is the very first exposure from 0 to 100 is pretty high. And sometimes it even spikes when they start it. Woo, it goes up. And then we stay in it, in the
Right.
exposure, typically have them do this over and over and over again for around 30 minutes. Okay. At the end, they typically end up a little bit lower than what they started. Then we go into their
Right.
second exposure and their second session. Maybe they start off the same amount. Maybe they don't have as big of a spike and they end a little bit lower. Over time, what starts to happen is they're starting lower SUDs and they're ending lower SUDs.
Gotcha.
And that's how we would habituate to anything, right? When we're talking about
Right.
habituation doesn't just happen when we do it once, right? If we're talking about training for a marathon,
Right.
which is what is it, 26, something, probably 26 miles?
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
have you ever known anyone to train for a marathon? They don't just start off running 26 miles, right?
Right.
They start off running 5 and they do that for a week. Then they add on another mile or 2 miles. And they're doing 7 miles and they add on, right? Because their body habituates. Okay, now I'm used to doing 5. Let's slowly add on a little bit more. The same with our brain. We want to habituate it over time and it takes a lot of repetition.
Right.
Yeah.
yeah. No, it fascinates me. So if I'm quiet, it's just all running through my head because I can think of friends and coworkers and go, yeah, I can see where they definitely want to avoid what they went through here. And so, but then by avoiding it makes it so much worse. And like you said, that amygdala just locks in at that high rate
Yeah.
and it just stays there for everything. And so
Yeah.
it's kind of cool how, well, it stays in there for everything. It's all based in this one or couple of calls. And I guess, does this work for complex PTSD as well? Because you can't just go and reiterate, tell, I mean, you can't tell all the stories. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So typically, you cut out there for a second, but right. So typically, or not typically, when we're doing trauma focused treatment, we have the person start with what they would say is one of the worst traumas that still
Okay.
affect them today. What
Right.
starts to happen is sometimes, um, maybe we work through that, and then there's still kind of like a little bit of a thorn in something else, and then we start from there. But typically, again, we're not going through. They're not starting off in the same place that they were processing that major one.
Mhm.
But typically what happens is the effects trickle down. The brain learns that now when I start thinking about and talking about all that starts to actually trickle down so that the top traumas, working on the top traumas, trickles down to the other things. And I know being a first responder psychologist is not easy all the time to pick one. So, it's kind of like, what is one of the things that really is still sticking? What is one of the things that you try and avoid thinking about the most, right? What is one of the things that still really sticks with you today? And we start with that. We start at the top. Um,
Let's go back to memory though. What about those times where you're coming in and you've got all the hallmarks of PTSD? You've got all those leaves, and you've got you've whether it's a childhood based or a job based or whatever it is, but you're not recalling that. You know something's there, but you can't put your finger on it. How do you deal with that?
yeah.
How do you bring that out of somebody?
So it's really, really fascinating. When we're first starting our exposures, I worked with many individuals who they might have those major gaps, and I'm not pushing them to know exactly what happened. What's really fascinating and a pretty fun thing, and as a psychologist see, is as we continue these exposures, more details start coming out. So I'm not
Mhm.
really doing anything in the sense of like helping them to remember those specific details. What starts to happen is once we start to break up that locked part, right, is slowly other details will start to trickle in, and they'll start to be like, I mean, I've seen it and heard it more times than I can count. Like, holy shit, I forgot about that. When I start
Yeah.
talking about that, oh my God, I forgot about that, right? And again, we're not talking about unconscious memories that we're just talking about there's so much shit piled on top of it that now it's
Mhm.
getting the space to actually come out. So it's not really anything different. Basically, work with from where someone is. You have them in the imaginal exposure. You systematically basically help them through um, doing the exposure in a way that they recall and talk about and recite through every detail that they can remember. But if they have major gaps in their memory, that's fine. They do what they can remember, and we continue to do it. And typically, I honestly, I can't. I don't know if I've ever had a case where I've had someone just who still just has that massive gap in their memory. There's might be small details here and there, but those massive gaps, I don't know if in successful, someone who stuck with their treatment and stayed in their treatment, that I've ever had it where they finished treatment successfully and that they still had these massive gaps in their memory. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, so we take that, you take this habituation, and that's not muting, excuse me, that's leveling off the amygdala.
mhm,
That's one section you
yeah,
talked about.
yeah.
So what do you start to work on then?
Right. So again, first line of defense or first line of attack is the amygdala. Because remember, when the amygdala is firing, it's so loud that it completely, we'll talk about atrophying the other parts of our brain. Literally, the
Right.
hippocampus becomes atrophied, right? So once we start to recalibrate the amygdala and the amygdala is not screaming and shutting down other parts of our brain like our prefrontal cortex, then we can actually start to process, make meaning of all these aspects and details of the trauma that we've been shutting out every way possible through porn, through alcohol, through staying busy, through avoiding people, all these other ways, right? Now we can actually start to make meaning of and process these things. I don't want to go into too much detail because it goes, this is more of the cognitive side of things, but I can tell you that once we dampen down or recalibrate that amygdala, it allows us to actually go in and store those aspects, process those emotions, process those memories, consolidate them, and actually store them properly. So now we're picking up all those files that have been
Mhm.
all over the place, right? And we're actually able to relabel them. That's one thing. So part of trauma therapy is not only adding new labels like, oh, yeah, this was here, and now I can actually store this away. But along with all the files all over the place, some of them have the wrong labels on them,
Mm.
right? And so we actually have to relabel them a little bit sometimes. And so we can actually go in and allow these other parts of the brain that have been atrophied for however long, 1 year, 5 years. I've worked with a lot of Vietnam vets, so 40 years, right? And start to rebuild them so that we can allow that prefrontal cortex, those neuronal branches to start to grow or start to reconnect again. And so that that atrophied hippocampus can actually build. So really main aspect that is similar across all treatments is recalibration of the amygdala, of that fight or flight response. And then we go in and we do more cognitive work and actually work on things like this comes with a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, where we go in and systematically actually have them gather evidence, make meaning, restore these memories, etc. So now things are in a little bit better place than they were before.
So that the most important part, and I don't know if it's even, it has to be the most important part because nothing else gets done until you quiet the amygdala.
Mhm.
And then you you don't just stop that. I'm assuming there's still some work, there's some maintenance
Oh
there.
yeah, exposure continues throughout. And so what we start to do, we start with that imaginal exposure. Again, we call it imaginal, but it's not imaginary. It's actually someone recalling the details of their
Mhm.
trauma. Um, but what we want to do is we want to continue to keep making sure that recalibration maintains, and then we start to actually plan exposures out in the real world. And again, this could be external exposures, where we do a hierarchy and we have someone, let's say, we do a hierarchy. And what I mean by that is, say, we'll use the example of someone going to the same grocery store, same time, same day every week, and they will not go to the grocery store unless
Right.
they can go at that time. So, let's say it's 6 a.m. We don't start with throwing them at, hey, go to Trader Joe's at 5 p.m. on a Friday, right? That's not their exposure. We don't start at that
Right.
super massive one, right? Or like if someone's avoiding crowds, hey, go to Petco Park at a baseball game, right? We're not
Right.
having them do that's not what we're talking about exposure. We slowly start to work them into it. And that's different for different people, but we create that hierarchy even just for one exposure. It could be that, let's say they go at 7 a.m. Or let's say they have someone accompany them if they think that would be more helpful for them. And then once they start to go at 7 a.m. and their SUDS levels are starting to go down and their amygdala is not reacting, then maybe we move the time again, or maybe we have them go at 6 a.m. to another grocery store that they're
To a
not
different
familiar where
store.
everything is. They
Right.
can't just grab and go, right? So we start
Right.
to work up that way. So we're still continuing to work on that throughout treatment as well.
When you say those things, it starts to bring some things together for me at least, and hopefully for the listeners, because we do see so much almost ritualization in across like first responders. Everybody has the way they like to have it done.
Mhm.
Some of that is for survival because some of that is if you put the same things in the same pockets
Mhm.
in your gear, you know exactly where it is. That's understandable.
Mhm.
But like you said, going to the same store at the same time because that way you're not going to experience anything different. That's not necessarily understandable. That's
Exactly.
that's unhealthy.
Exactly. And here's the thing. I'm glad you brought that up. A couple of things that I want to make note of. One is that, remember, we're talking about things like you just said. We're talking about when our behavior, our habit, our rituals, our symptoms are starting to cause impairment in our life. Like now I'm not
Mhm.
actually attending my daughter's sports events, and my relationship with my daughter is suffering because I don't want to go be around that crowd of people, right?
Mhm.
Not, hey, I mean, listen, I prefer not to go to the grocery store at 5 p.m. on a Friday, right?
Mhm.
But if it's, I can only go at this time, this day to this grocery store. And if I don't go, I will not get food that week, right? That there's a difference between that. So I'm not
Right.
talking about, yeah, what people prefer, or it's okay even to try and mitigate, have safety risks and mitigate those things. But when they start causing that impairment in your life, that's when we start to see it as, okay, that's the type of post-traumatic stress injury that we start to address. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is related to hypervigilance in first responders and military. Um, when we talk about the baseline hypervigilance levels of civilians versus first responders military, generally speaking, first responders military, their baseline level of hypervigilance is going to be higher. That's okay,
Mhm.
right? We're not trying to change that. You know why? Because it's very adaptive. You need to
You're
be
right.
hypervigilant on the job,
Yeah.
right? We don't want to take that away. And we can't just say, okay, go into your uniform and go on shift. And then when you're off shift, you go back to civilian, right? That's all you do. No, that's not realistic,
Simple.
right? So I want people to understand that this level of hypervigilance is not always a bad thing and become adaptive. It's okay if you notice that you're still a little bit more, you know where the exits are, et cetera. It's more when that hypervigilance becomes excessive and unnecessary,
Right.
when there's no actual threat around, right? Excessive and unnecessary, and it starts to cause, what's the word? Impairment, right? That's
Impairment.
when that hypervigilance threshold has been crossed. And it's like, all right, this is more of that clinical levels of post-traumatic stress injury. So hypervigilance in and of itself, when off the job, is not a bad thing. We're not trying to change that, but just when it starts to actually keep you from going places, doing things, when it's keeping you from enjoying things that you do go to, right? Those types of aspects, when that's happening consistently, that's the type of hypervigilance that we want to address.
It interests me when you say the avoidance, because we do drink. We porn is a big thing in first responder community. Alcohol, drugs, you know, s- isolating. Those are all those avoidant behaviors that
Mhm.
you spoke about. Um, I just lost my train of thought. See, there you go. Oh, I know where I was going with it. Even when you leave the fire service, people are still using those behaviors to avoid. So they're still drinking.
Mhm.
They're still checking online porn. They're still watching TV to just veg out. And those are all the avoidant things. And so you leave that. I think there's this misnomer that if you're going to step away from the fire service, boom, things get better because you're not exposing yourself on a day to day basis,
Yeah.
or a cop or military. You're not exposing yourself to those to the traumas anymore, but you're still doing the avoidant behavior. So you haven't dealt with any of the other stuff that you saw when you were in. So things don't get better. I can only imagine things might actually get worse as you go.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of research on retirement or medical retirement, whatever it is, when someone leaves the fire service, that rates of PTSD, rates of suicide, rates of alcohol abuse, those skyrocket, and it's not coincidental. Um, I've worked with, like I said, I've worked with Vietnam veterans who are in their mid to late 70s who their PTSD symptoms skyrocketed 5 years before. And they're like, what? I was like normal. I was fine before
Yeah.
then. So it's not always this thing happened. And now oh, yeah, I understand why I developed this because this thing happened just 2 months ago, right? I've worked with a lot of individuals who were normal, and I'm using normal because that's relative for one, but they were getting along, doing their normal shit that they were doing and avoiding, keeping their head down, doing all the things that were keeping them at bay. And then they retire, and then all of a sudden their PTS symptoms come up big time,
Right.
right? So yeah, trauma is cumulative. It is cumulative. We cannot take this one trauma here and this one trauma here, and they're mutually exclusive and they play nicely, including childhood trauma. I can tell you anecdotally that a lot of my firefighters have really terrible childhood trauma. They're like, I don't know. I haven't thought about that in forever. That doesn't bother me. Let's talk about this
Yeah.
other stuff that I'm dealing with, right? That is all cumulative. All the stuff on the job, all the calls, the childhood trauma is cumulative. Trauma is
Right.
not something that just happens in a box. So even if you
You
haven't thought
say
about that for years and years and years, there's still some kind of accumulation going on.
You say anecdotally, and I can speak to the same thing. I've 100 people sharing stories on this show, and I ask, well, what was childhood like? And they say, well, my parents were divorced, my dad was abusive, and then you start in my head, I start adding up the ACEs score, and
Mhm.
it's very rare that I get a guest on this show that says I didn't have any issues in childhood. My parents are still married. I went to whatever school. I went to college. I did this, and you go, well, that's a zero. So what's going on? So where did we turn here? And we come into this profession damaged, and we damage ourselves more with the profession.
Well, listen, there's a big aspect of self-selection into your profession, right?
Mhm.
I wouldn't choose to go into your profession. I wouldn't do well in it. That would be very difficult for me to do what you did and do, right? So to go into that profession, you have to have certain characteristics to choose that, right? You have to, generally speaking, be able to withstand things that your average person doesn't withstand, both physically and mentally, right?
Right.
Um, a lot of my first responders are also very much type A personalities. They can be more adrenaline driven even before they get into the job. And they can be someone who comes from a really shitty childhood, who's experienced some terrible things and wants to do whatever they can to make sure that they help other people, right? Helping behavior is very common. And there's a lot of research on this, not necessarily specifically on first responders, but individuals who've experienced tragedy and difficulty and abuse and trauma in their childhood are more likely to have some of those those characteristics in adulthood. So all of that makes sense, when we're talking about the general characteristics of our first responders. But that you're right, a lot of individuals come into this. You wouldn't believe how many firefighters I've worked with that have been on the job for 15 years are coming in with clinically significant post-traumatic stress that they want to get worked on. They're expecting to talk about the calls, and all of a sudden, they come out with, I was molested when I was a kid,
Yeah.
right? And we basically end up doing trauma treatment on that trauma as opposed to all the calls, right? Because that's the one that's been locked away for a long time, and this snowball has been accumulating for a long, long, long time.
Right. And I mean, I've shared on the show before, and I had my own experience with that as someone who resisted even talk therapy for forever and decided that I had to give it a try. And I went and I found, I got lucky with the counselors that we had at work, and I connected and I opened up, and it was I want to talk about the dead baby, and she wanted to talk about second grade with my dad, and it's just like, wait a second. I'm here. I don't have daddy issues. Fuck that.
Listen, no, I
And
came here
no,
for this, okay?
I do have daddy issues. We had to
Yeah.
talk about that. I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
I want to talk about this.
Yeah.
So yeah, that happens quite often. So yeah.
And that's another thing too, I want to also pop in there is, I don't want to fully shit on talk therapy. I'm saying that talk therapy, once someone crosses that threshold in clinically significant post-traumatic stress injury, talk therapy at that time is not enough. Now, once someone has gone through trauma-focused treatment, their symptoms, their amygdala is recalibrated, they're functioning better. Then, they can switch. I mean, I have many of my first responders that come in, I call them, with check-ins, proactive check-ins, just kind of, they come in once or twice, once a month or once every 2 months to just check in. And that's more, we're talking. And if there's something that we have to kind of address, maybe they have something flared up, some stuff. But, talk therapy definitely has its place and can be very beneficial in a lot of ways. But when someone has anything clinically significant, whether we're talking about major depression, social anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress, we want evidence-based, systematic evidence-based approaches until those symptoms kind of decrease and get more stabilized.
So we talked about the amygdala, talked about hippocampus. What are you doing for the prefrontal cortex then?
Well, the
In this
prefrontal
whole-
cortex is very much more so the cognitive behavioral therapy side of things. And again, the
Mhm.
prefrontal cortex, we don't go in straight on that side because, again, when the amygdala is firing, we can't. It's difficult to
Mhm.
actually think through, use reasoning and actually think through these things and talk about these things when our amygdala is firing. So that really comes into the cognitive behavioral therapy side of things. We tend to, it depends on which of those three treatments you're doing. For example, if we're talking about cognitive processing therapy, it's much heavier on the cognitive side.
Mhm.
So we're actually identifying kind of how our trauma has changed the way we think. Things like individuals who have post-traumatic stress injury think very black and white, and typically it's things like no one can be trusted, civilians can't be trusted, everywhere is unsafe, very black and white belief systems that actually impact our behavior. Because if I think nowhere is safe, then I'm always going to be on guard, right? So
Right.
what these core beliefs are actually, that are really ingrained in us, they actually impact our behavior as well and our emotions. And so we address those. There's a lot of course, too, with post-traumatic stress injury. There's a lot of we don't feel so great about ourselves. So there's a lot of, I'm a piece of shit, I'm toxic, I'm weak, I'm broken. I should have reacted faster to that. If I had just reached out to him, maybe he'd still be alive.
Mhm.
We really kind of go in and focus on that.
So that prefrontal cortex is that's going to there's some part of that that's going to start improving just because the amygdala calms.
It's allowed to actually, you're allowed to actually utilize what it's meant to do. Now,
Right.
kind of, what's the analogy I was just trying to use? It's almost like puzzle pieces, right? So once the amygdala recalibrates, we are then now allowed to actually take all the puzzle pieces out. Now we have all the puzzle pieces in front of us, but they're not put together yet, right?
Right.
But the puzzle pieces are actually out. Before,
Right.
they're locked up in that box and we can't get the box open. So now we have
Makes
puzzle
sense.
pieces all over. We're still like, shit, this is still a lot. Like, how do we even put this
Mhm.
puzzle together, right? But now we're actually able to start putting the puzzle together to see what's going on and actually make meaning of
Right.
it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So in these three modalities, it's all about quieting the amygdala so you can get the other work done.
First line of attack is quieting the amygdala. And then the other part is also really important. I mean, I'd say they're equally important, but in most cases, not all, but most cases, um, we need to go in and recalibrate the amygdala in order to be quite honest with you, on the psychologist side, not on the person actually doing the work side.
Mhm.
Um, the psychologist side, my personal opinion is that the recalibration part is a lot easier for me, because it's much more just systematic,
Right.
and the body does the work, right?
Mhm.
Um, Once we start going into that other aspect, I got to do a lot more work, and everyone is different in terms of their trauma, their core beliefs, how they made sense of their trauma and their role, how it's affecting them. So that takes a lot more, it's a lot more intricate on that end. So both are equally as important. Just doing that aspect, typically, if we just recalibrated that, typically someone still feels like shit. They still think they're a piece of shit. They still have these core beliefs that could be impacting them. So we want to go in on both sides of things, but for that first line of attack is just, we let the body do what the body is designed to do.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's there's a lot of information there.
I know it's a lot.
Yeah, we haven't even talked, and maybe, and no pun intended, pick your brain another time about how do you do this from a prevention side instead of a proactive instead of a reactive side, and I think I'm going to guess by the way you're nodding your head that's something that fire departments and police departments and military need to get on that bandwagon and start preventing instead of curing.
Yes. This is my whole this is what I want to tattoo across my face. Working with a lot of department is that I call it the three lines of defense, and I actually have a visual that I showed when I get brought into departments to show them. But a lot of departments focus on the third line of defense, the purely reactive line of defense.
Mhm.
That's crisis, right? And that's very important to have, by the way. We need to have those resources there to for those individuals who get that snowball has rolled so much that they're starting to roll off the cliff, right? We need that. But there's a lot of departments that completely neglect those other first two lines of defense. And ideally, that's where we're really targeting to prevent someone from even getting or needing that third,
Right.
right? And the first line is that just purely proactive, that first keeping healthy people healthy. That's what we like to
Am
do, right? We want to
amazing
people as
concept.
healthy as possible. That's that first line of defense. And there's a lot of things and resources that can be put into allowing that. And then the second line is what I call early intervention. And that's when, hey, let's look at just visualize that spectrum I was talking about. We have green on this end, bright red on this end, but a lot of changing colors in between, right? Green,
Mhm.
dark green, light, light yellow, orange, darker orange, light red, dark red, right? Once we
Mhm.
start getting into that yellow area, that's like the area for early intervention. So we can come in and actually, hey, let's stop the snowball from actually moving into that red zone, right? Early
Right.
intervention. And listen, we're all going to be in that yellow zone throughout different points in our life. The idea, it's not realistic to be like, I'm going to stay in the green zone forever, right? That's just not realistic because life is life. But what we want to do is keep ourselves out of that red area. So once we are equipped with the tools, the knowledge, etc., to notice when we're starting to get into that yellow zone, then we can utilize our toolbox to kind of get ourselves back into the light green zone. So,
Right.
yes, in answer to what you're saying, there's a lot more on the front end too that can be done. Not one silver bullet, not just one thing, right? But a variety of different things work for different people, but utilizing those resources and tools to try and prevent us from getting into that red area is super important.
Yeah, and I think that's a whole conversation unto itself. We probably spend an hour and a half, 2 hours on that alone. So
Yeah, bring me back on.
cool. Well, why don't we talk about my last two questions?
Okay.
When was the last time you felt or saw something that would just held you in awe? It was just your moment of awe. It just kind of took your breath.
This is going to be super cheesy, but it's the first thing that came to my mind. I got married 4 weeks ago, and it was a pretty wild feeling when I was walking down the aisle and
Yeah.
I saw my husband standing there. It was a very, can't even put words on it. It was quite the feeling. So, yeah, I can't even put words on it because it was just kind of surreal to me. So that was probably the last time. Yeah.
And that definitely makes sense. I mean, this is something that I don't know how long it was building up to that spot once you know the proposal and everything, but you have that whole process where you build up to it and then it all comes together and just like, wow.
Yeah, that's exactly. And like yeah, it just builds up to it, and then you're doing it, and you're like, oh my God, that's my husband at the end of the aisle. Like, oh my God, I'm getting married as I'm walking down the aisle.
All right, so we'll talk about books, and I want to pick your brain about something real quick. And it's a book that I read that is about the brain, and it was a quick read. And maybe you've read it, maybe it's quackery. I'm not sure. 7.5 Lessons About the Brain.
Actually, never
Have you ever-
heard of that.
Okay, and that's kind of where I start working with this analogy of that forest, the root system, and how the neuroplasticity piece of it.
Well,
So there, I'm gonna throw one out to the audience. That it's an easy. I thought it was an easy read. It's called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain.
Mm.
And it, you know, we hear this, we hear these sections of the brain where the reptilian brain and things like that. And I think they've started to fall out of favor, some of those terms, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they've started to fall out of favor, into more of a, not a universal, but more of an interconnected model.
mhm.
It,
Yes.
is that, am I on the right track with that thinking?
Yes, you are on the right track with that thinking. Much more interconnected model. Considering it's kind of like what we call the biopsychosocial model. Have you ever heard of that?
Mhm.
Right, you're considering all these factors, not just when you go into the doctor for something and you're saying my stomach has been hurting a lot. They're not just going, okay, here, let's just treat that symptom, right? You need to know what all the factors. Oh, I've actually haven't
Right.
been sleeping well. I've had a ton of stress. My diet has changed, right? All these factors that go into it. So yeah, it's just a much more interconnected model.
So I'll throw that one out there for you. 7.5 Lessons About the Brain.
Cool.
What's a book that you would like to recommend that either related to this or not? It doesn't matter.
Ooh, that's a great question. Related to this, I would recommend The Body Keeps a Score.
Hmm.
Um, it's written by a trauma doctor. Unrelated, well, it's related to it, but I would recommend The Happiness Trap. You ever heard of that one?
Okay.
One of my favorite books. I think it's written by the doctor who developed what's called ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. But it's to me, a very life changing book that goes into a lot of the things that we work on in evidence based therapy. But it's not meant just for post traumatic stress necessarily. It's kind of meant to cover the whole gamut. So I would recommend The Happiness Trap.
Cool. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
This talk's been fascinating, and I think I could have picked your brain for an hour and a half, two more hours, just because it fascinates me. So
Fascinates me
I,
too.
yeah, obviously you've dedicated your life to it, so that's we get the benefit from that. So thank you very much. Thanks for being open to coming on, and thanks for everything you just shared with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And we'll look to see if we get you back on to talk about the preventive part, because I think that's right now, it's probably more important that people start paying attention to that and enacting some of that in their departments instead of waiting for
the people to get to that crisis, that mode where do or die, literally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Happy to talk more about it.
Thanks for listening to another episode of The Things We All Carry. Head over to the website, thethingsweallcarry.com, for show notes, resources, and to sign up for the newsletter. Until next week, take care of yourselves and remember to check in on each other.